Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to make my contribution to the budget debate 2022 in a budget which is titled Steadfast Against All Challenges, Resolute in Building Our One Guyana. Mr. Speaker, the title of this budget says it all. The PPP administration is unrealistic, it is delusional, and it is confused.
Well, Honorable Member Mr. Harmon, just give me 2 seconds. I will start back your clock. You might be a little bit away from your microphone, so we're not getting a good audio feed. And in order to help us, honorable members, I'm asking that we reduce the excess noise so that we can hear, and the technicians to see if they can do something with the internet volume. Honorable member, you may proceed. I'm starting back the clock at 6:07. Go ahead.
Titled Steadfast Against All Challenges, Resolute in Building Our One Guyana. Mr. Speaker, this title of the budget says it all. That the PPP administration is unrealistic, it is delusional, and it is confused. The only challenge, Mr. Speaker, the administration needs to be steadfast against are the many among them with an anti-Guyanese mentality and who appear to have been baptized in contaminated waters and filled with crassness. Therein lies the reason, Mr. Speaker, that the budget is titled with a statement like resolute in building our one Guyana. Not in building one Guyana for all Guyanese, but our one Guyana. Mr. Speaker, we don't have to ask who is the our being referred to in this budget title. Since this administration went into office, it was evident that there is our Guyana, which they have created and embraced for themselves, their families and friends. Then there's the other Guyana, which they have treated with scant regard and punitive disdain. We have some very strong signals of who is not a part of their one Guyana. The working class, the poor, the sons and daughters of slaves, the sons and daughters of indentured servants, our indigenous population, and everyone who opposes their style of governance. Mr. Speaker, let me, at this point, commend my colleague MPs for their professional and clear treatment of this budget so that the Guyanese people can understand the true meaning of these figures that were thrown into this budget to finance what I will consider to be a visionless plan. From the first speaker on the opposition side, Mr. Speaker, who described the budget as disrespectful, discriminatory, and deceitful, to the very last speaker on the opposition side, in my view, we have successfully dismantled and pierced the veil of opaqueness that surrounds the presentation by Dr. Ashley Singh. I, like most Guyanese, am extremely proud of my colleagues, MPs like Jaretta Finance, who exposed the government's poor record on the non-oil economy. And this is basically what Jaretta spoke to. That in 2020, the non-oil GDP was down by 7.3%. In 2021, the non-oil GDP was projected to grow by 6.1%, but only grew by 4.6%. The non-oil economy is worse today than it was in 2019. Then, of course, there was MP Natasha Flew-Bess, who outlined a food basket, or the way in which $28,000 will be spent by a pensioner. And this is what she said, that if you cost a dinner at $300 for 30 days in a month, that will be $9,000 to be spent by a pensioner. If you costed a lunch at $500, by 30 days, that's $15,000. If you allocated $2,000 a month to pay GPL, and that will basically bring you, along with the phone bill of $2,000, will bring you to a total of $28,000. There's nothing left after that. You can't even afford to deal with a breakfast. And so, Mr. Speaker, these are the challenges which we are faced with as the poor people in this country. And so I would like to say that these contributions, Mr. Speaker, have excellently brought home the reality of what this budget means to the ordinary man and woman. Let me also, Mr. Speaker, take this opportunity to thank Dr. Nicolette Henry for her sterling service in this honorable house and wish her well in her future endeavors. Dr. Singh, honorable member, I am aware that the budget is a painstaking operation in which you allocate monies in a given year to government priorities. I commend you for seeking to accomplish the impossible. Mr. Speaker, before I go much further, please permit me to address a few issues which were raised by the two previous speakers, the Honorable Member Gail Teixeira and the Honorable Member Anil Nandlal, the Attorney General. First of all, the Honorable Gail Teixeira spoke to the fact that Guyana was in a very bad state when the PPP took office in 2020. But I need to remind the Honorable Member that in 2014, and when we took office in 2015, that is the AP and the AFC took office, that Guyana was in the throes of if the Financial Action Task Force and the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force conditionalities. We were about to be blacklisted. And it took the efforts of the administration of David Granger and then untiring efforts of Bassey Williams as the Attorney General to bring us out of that condition. And certainly, the Honorable Member Gail Teixeira and the Attorney General will be well aware of that. They are the ones that attended these financial task force meetings in Paris and in all of other parts of the world. And so they will be well aware of that. Mr. Speaker, we also have to recall that during that period before 2015, Guyana was described internationally as a narco state. It is what was described in some international magazines as a tattered legacy of bad infrastructure, a tattered legacy of a people with little or no hope, a demoralized public service. And as one writer in the Stabrook News, Mr. Ralph Ramkaran, said that at that time, corruption had assumed an industrial scale. So that is what we had, industrial scale corruption, a tattered legacy, we were in the throes of being blacklisted by the Financial Action Task Force. We had a demoralized public service. This is what we found. This is what the PPP gave to us after 23 years in office. And they like to say that this is a continuing administration, which started in 1992. And so what we are seeing now is a continuation of that same failed policy, which produced that type of environment in Guyana. So the Honorable Member, Madam Gail Teixeira, I would just like to remind you of these issues. There are many others, but I can't spend all of my time dealing with that today. Mr. Speaker, then of course, it was this crassness, which I call it, this crassness of the Attorney General, who, apart from trying to explain that he went to Queen's College and therefore he had a certain pedigree, and that the Honorable Member on the opposition side went to St. Rose's, therefore he has a different pedigree. This is what we are talking about. But the Honorable Member made a statement which I believe was very, very dishonorable, and one for which I believe the PNC should call upon him to make an apology. Mr. Speaker, every year, the People's Progressive Party goes to Babujan, where they celebrate the life and the legacy of Dr. Chedi Jagan. And the country recognizes that, and the country treats it with the respect which that requires. But, Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Attorney General this afternoon basically denigrated such an activity by the People's National Congress to go to the Botanical Gardens on an annual basis to celebrate the life and legacy of two former presidents, President Forbes Burnham and President Desmond Hoyt, and he likened it as to going to raise up the kabaka to help us in our elections. That's disrespectful. And I believe the Honorable Member, in his exuberant outburst, must understand the consequences of statements like that made by a senior member of the PPP Politburo. He's a senior member, he's not just any ordinary member. When you see photographs of the 5 top persons in the government, he's one of them. And so it is disrespectful for him to basically treat an activity which we revere on an annual basis as going to beg the kabaka. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Anil Nandlal also went on to in his usual tirade about the 2020 elections, and that all hell broke loose after the results started to come in. But the Honorable Member must know, and it cannot escape him, that on the 6th of March, that when he spoke about all hell broke loose, that it was his party and his party leadership that had been engaged in activities at the Elections Commission office in Georgetown. The Honorable Member must know that. And finally, Mr. Speaker, because some of these matters are the subject of elections petitions, let me say that the acid test of the 2020 general and regional elections will be what comes out of the process of the recount which took place at the Artichon Conference Center. It will not be determined by how many people recognize you and all of that. It is what the electors decided. That will be the acid test. And when these matters come before the court, we will determine whether in fact who was right and who was wrong. Mr. Speaker, the reality that Dr. Singh the Honorable Member, Dr. Ashley Singh, who I consider to be an honorable man, and I respect him, is that he has been asked to present a budget to this country based on a plan by his bosses at the Ministry of the Presidency, a plan which is visionless. And so just as you were unable to sign the $2,000 bill, Dr. Singh, this is the same reason why you have to now face the irony and the criticism of this country based on a budget that has no vision. And Mr. Speaker, it is no secret that after 4 days of debating and after a marathon presentation by Dr. Ashley Singh, that the Vice President and the Honorable Member, Mr. Jack Dio, had to take to television yesterday to explain this vision. So what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, if after 4 days, all of your ministers cannot explain the vision on which this budget is based, and it requires the Vice President himself to go in what he considers to be a calm atmosphere to explain to the people of Guyana what are the philosophical underpinnings of this budget, then certainly, if they can explain it, the people can understand it. This is the critical point, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues have asked me to deal with the governance mechanism and the governance structure that impacts this budget which we are dealing with. And as is known, Mr. Speaker, every budget brought to this House by this administration reflects this OUR, this OUR, One Guyana theme. None of the previous budgets catered directly to the development of the poor and the working class. The average Guyanese have not benefited from the two budgets presented thus far in this House. And yet again, minuscule benefits are being offered to the working class and the unemployed. Mr. Speaker, the senior minister in the office of the president with responsibility for finance should redo this anti-Guyanese budget and come again. The Honourable Member, Dr. Ashley Singh, has a budget title that is longer than the benefits in the budget for the poor and the working class citizens of this country. In fact, if you add the budget title to the title that has been given to the Honourable Minister, you will see how long that is. You will see how long that is. But of course, these names sometimes are meant to create a smoke screen, so you don't really see what is behind it. And so rather than calling Dr. Ashley Singh the Minister of Finance, he gave him a long name just to say he is not the Minister of Finance. And in like manner, this budget, it gives you a long title just to say it is not what it intends or what it portends to be. Mr. Speaker, this 2022 budget is prepared to utilize the funds from the Natural Resources Fund, which is the patrimony of all Guyanese. But most Guyanese, to them, their lives have not seen good days under any PPP administration. The fact remains, Mr. Speaker, that yet another PPP administration has failed to deliver a good or a better life for all Guyanese through its plans, its programs, and policies. Mr. Speaker, it is little wonder that the new oil finds that are announced by Exxon and lately by CGX have not generated excitement and interest by the Guyanese people. It is because they cannot see the benefit of all of these oil finds, and this petro state that we are creating, they do not see the benefits trickling down to them that affects their livelihood. Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that the policies and plans of Budget 2022 will create a great life for a select few in their version of our Guyana. Mr. Speaker, building one Guyana must include equity. It must include justice. It must include fairness. It must include transparency. It must include inclusionary democracy. It must include opportunity for our young people. It must include a better quality of life for pensioners. It must include respect for our public servants. It must include freedom of speech. And most importantly, must include benefits for women who are predominantly the head of households in this country. It must, of course, too, Mr. Speaker, include opportunities for the creation of wealth for the other Guyana, the economically disadvantaged. This budget does not provide access to opportunities and a better quality of life. A national budget has to speak to development at an individual level, at the community level, and at the national level. The impact of that budget has to be felt by vendors in the market, professionals, engineers, doctors, plumbers, etc. Instead, Mr. Speaker, this budget caters to the friends and families of the People's Progressive Party. Mr. Speaker, we will see many letters in the press and interviews of the honorable members and ministers from the PPP speaking of how good the budget is for Guyana. But as the saying goes, he who feels it knows it. Mr. Speaker, he who feels it knows it. If you want to know where the shoe pinches, put it on. And so, Mr. Speaker, in Budget 2022, the vast majority of the people of Guyana are made to settle for pittance at the bottom, while those at the top continue to create an environment for themselves to continue the pilferage of the public coffers. As an opposition, Mr. Speaker, we will not stand by and see that happen. And along with a mobilized citizenry, we will fight this scourge before it takes hold in this country. Mr. Speaker, one of the trends we have become accustomed to in every PPP administration's budget is the investment of billions of dollars into failed projects and plans. Remember the famous fiber optic cable project, which was managed by the son of a former president, which cost the people of Guyana over $1.3 billion. Mr. Speaker, it was on the 2nd of November 2018 that the then PPP opposition leader at that time flagged the PPP. This is the PPP opposition leader, flagged the PPP over this failed project. One media outlet, the Guyana Chronicle, published an article titled, and I quote, "Jaguar blasts failed PPP 1.3 billion fiber optic cable." In that same article, the honorable member was quoted as saying, and I quote, "It was a failure. The design parameters were all wrong," end of quote. Mr. Speaker, I want to use those very words to say to Dr. Ashni Singh that this budget is a failure. Its design parameters are all wrong, as it does not uplift the lives of the poor and working class in our society. Design parameters wrong. Mr. Speaker, I give you another example to illustrate my point. In 2013, under the PPP, a bridge was built at Maruka for $43 million Guyana dollars by a contractor. The work was poor, And so even after it was completed, the bridge could not be used. The contractor was paid all the money. But when he was questioned by Stabrook News about the poor work, he said, "It was not me. It was the government that gave me an inadequate design to build the bridge." Mr. Speaker, when the AP and UFC came into office in 2015, we had to rebuild that bridge. Mr. Speaker, according to the contractor, the design parameters that he received from the PPP government was wrong. That was the problem with the bridge. The design was bad. Mr. Speaker, that also is the problem with this budget. The design is bad, Dr. Singh. I know you know how to put together a budget, but if you get bad design, bad parameters, you can only expect failure. And speaking of bad designs, Mr. Speaker, we have the return of the famous Amida Falls Hydro Project. Mr. Speaker, it is ludicrous for any government to be obsessed with funding failed projects. But it's the nature of the PPP that drives this style of governance. Failed projects translate as success to the PPP because their friends get the contracts and benefits are filtered down to them and their families, what they call trickle-down corruption. And I heard this word used quite often during the course of this debate. It is what we call, Mr. Speaker, new wine in old skin, or as the Americans call it, pork barrel politics. Pork barrel politics. Mr. Speaker, then we have the issue of the Guyana Sugar Corporation. And this corporation be continuously used as a political tool by the PPP. The PPP does not care about the sugar workers or the industry. But what they do know is that it is necessary to have the sugar workers and their families be dependent on Gaisuko so as to ensure that this single voting bloc remains beholden to them. So Gaisuko will continue to make less than it costs to produce sugar year after year. It will continue to deprive projects in other sectors of billions of much needed budgetary allocations that could bring short, medium, and long-term relief to citizens, especially during this time of COVID. The billions given to Gaisuko, Mr. Speaker, could have gone towards providing free education at the University of Guyana. But education is not as important as reopening estates of a failed industry. To date, Mr. Speaker, Gaisuko has received over $30 billion from the previous two budgets and supplementals, and it is set to receive another $6 billion in this budget. We are yet to see the reopening of any estate. So, Mr. Speaker, while the administration continues to fund its failures, Guyanese must wait until after the next elections, according to this administration, to have access to free tertiary education. But let me say this to the PPP administration, Mr. Speaker. On this issue, they are right. I agree with them. Because the next administration will be the AP and AFC administration. And they will certainly make tertiary education a reality and a priority as part of our education and as part of us providing what is called an education nation. That's part of our plan. So the PPP, you're right on that. You're right on that. Mr. Speaker, the AP and UAFC made sure that our policies, plans, and projects cater to all Guyanese during our time in office. Mr. Speaker, over time, we have put more disposable income in the pockets of our citizens through a number of measures. And these included, but were not limited to, increases in minimum wage, from $39,000 to $65,000, while increasing the income tax threshold simultaneously. Mr. Speaker, this allowed public servants to have more discretionary income after covering their necessities. And that was done without oil money. That's how a caring government caters to its citizens. And of this, the honorable members on the government side should take note, because the small increase of the threshold and the invisible and intangible disposable income you are talking about has been all swallowed up even before it reaches the pocket of our public servants and our citizens. It's all eaten up by a cost of living that is increasing daily. Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that the PPP does not clearly understand the times in which we are living, because what we have in this budget are pittances being paraded as life-changing measures. The PPP administration is an administration whose policy is to make our people a nation of mendicants. The cash grants that they have placed in the budget are enough to have citizens look for another handout next year. Not enough to put them in a position where they are able to build sustainable livelihoods. Those on the government side spend no time addressing measures and policies that would have lasting positive impact, because they do not want an independent populace. They rely on a dependent population. Mr. Speaker, as we reflect on how the cash grants last year were distributed to our citizens, one cannot help but liken the modus operandi to exactly how drug lords operate when attempting to gain control over people and communities. They go into communities with large bags of money, along with their security with big guns, to share out money and buy over communities to increase their influence. It is interesting, Mr. Speaker, that in 2021, the PPP used the same method to get money to the people. I here again reiterate our call for the auditing of the disbursement of all those cash grants. And I call again on the Honorable President, His Excellency Mr. Irfan Ali, to demand that the Auditor General produces that audit which you instructed him to do. Why isn't he doing it? Is he just so disrespectful of the office? Or does he feel so comfortable that the president could give him an instruction and doesn't have to follow it because he's probably following the directions of some other power in the office of the president? Mr. Speaker, another continuing trend of the PPP budget is the lack of foresight, which is a general characteristic of their governance. Speaker, when we were in office, that is the AP and UFC, we placed restrictions on the importation of used tires and aged vehicles in order to protect our environment and to save lives. We implemented measures for the easy importation of electric vehicles and setting up of charging stations. Our administration was forward-thinking. Mr. Speaker, it appears as though we were too forward-thinking for the PPP, who decided to reverse our tires and vehicle policy. And now in Budget 2022, they are offering tax measures to benefit the importation of vehicles for industrial and commercial purposes. Not one thought was given to the fact that we are still in a pandemic and to providing incentives for school children and a fleet of vehicles for school children. Not a single thought was given to the importation of better vehicles for public transportation to aid in safer travel. No tax reduction or concession for frontline workers who want to purchase a vehicle to travel to work safely during this pandemic, so they can continue to serve the country and fellow citizens. And Mr. Speaker, according to the Minister of Health, there is no end in sight to this particular COVID-19 pandemic. Every so often we hear of a new variant. And so we have to adopt lifestyles to what is called this new normal. And in the consideration of this budget, this government ought to have taken into consideration this new normal and therefore provide vehicles for those frontline workers. Mr. Speaker, another very obvious trend in this PP budget is that it focuses heavily on measures to benefit the private sector, while little to no attention is placed on developing a strong, productive public sector to cater to the needs of this country. It's as if the government expects the private sector to deliver public service to the citizens. Mr. Speaker, this administration boasts about implementing measures that see the private sector saving some $6 billion, which they hope will be passed on to citizens. Instead, the citizens got an increase in the prices of most products, with no measures being implemented for direct benefit to them. The PP has turned to the private sector with the hope that profit will no longer guide their decision-making. Mr. Speaker, it must be clear to all that the administration is incompetent. Mr. Speaker, when we speak about the public sector, and you go through the entire budget speech by the Honorable Finance Minister, you see reference to public sector one time. Once. Mr. Speaker, in my contribution to the 2021 debate, the opposition posited 8 issues on which there was need to find common ground. These issues, in our view, would contribute to good governance in Guyana. And these issues were that our government, or any government for that matter, cannot function in a country like Guyana by just seeing red or green communities. Our communities are made up of people that provide the resources of this country, and therefore the state must provide resources to those communities in an equitable manner. Secondly, we argue that we should agree that constructive engagement based on clear principles and a broadening stakeholder engagement at the national, regional, community level is a sine qua non for our development. Mr. Speaker, and on this point, let me speak a little bit about these consultations and the fact that the Attorney General, in his address to the Parliament shortly, not so long ago, said that there was no consultation with the Leader of the Opposition on judicial appointments. Mr. Speaker, I don't know whether the honorable member, maybe when he looks back at the Hansard, will recognize that there's a mistake that has been made. But I can say that the honorable member, along with the Leader of the Opposition, the honorable member Barajagdio, President Granger, and myself, consulted not once, not more than once, on the appointment of judicial officers. And there is a record, I believe, in the public domain, in which at the end of one of those meetings, the Leader of the Opposition, as soon as he left the meeting, went to the media and said that he did not agree with the proposal made by President Granger. And so if we do not call that consultation, I don't know what is your understanding, the Honorable Attorney General, a Queen's College student, as to what consultation means. I think it's a very simple matter. The third issue, Mr. Speaker, that we raised at that time was that we should immediately shift from this ethnic marginalization and vindictiveness. The Honorable Gilda Shearer spoke and she almost moved my heart when she spoke this afternoon about what our one Guyana should be, how we should work together to benefit from what is happening to our country, the huge amount of resources that are coming to this country, and why we should work together as a people to ensure that the benefit goes to all. And so that was our third issue, that we should try to remove vindictiveness and marginalization. And maybe in their head, in the PPP's head, they are not being vindictive, they are not marginalizing people, but the general public outside here sees it differently. And so even if it is a question of perception, then we should work to deal with that perception. The fourth issue, Mr. Speaker, we said we should agree to meet the cause or redress of imbalances in this country. And this is most palpable in the distribution of these grants, in the way in which we go to communities and we skip some communities that are perceived to have supported the APNU AFC. And these things are very clear. The citizens speak about it. You don't have to go and share it Duncan to hear that. All of the other stations, you hear that. But some, of course, can carry it because they serve different masters. The fifth issue, Mr. Speaker, we spoke about was collectively focusing on poverty and the plight of our poor citizens. And this issue, I believe, has received some attention during the course of our debate and during the course of my presentation, that the poor citizens must feel that they have a place in this country, that they are not just to be consulted when it is time for elections and to get their votes, and then they are left behind thereafter. Or that if they are not part of the ruling party's apparatus, that nothing can happen for them. We have to work that, we have to work that out. We have to get rid of that. We believe that that's important enough. The sixth issue, of course, Mr. Speaker, was the need for us to work together to protect our sovereignty and our national patrimony. Well, I think we have started some work together on this Venezuelan issue, and I trust that that can continue. But certainly on our national patrimony, there is significant disagreement on the approach which the government has taken to dealing with the resources which come from the oil and gas sector. The seventh issue, Mr. Speaker, we raised was the question of the COVID-19 task force, that we felt it should be expanded to have an inclusive representation at meaningful levels. This continues to go on and on and on and on, and it seems to me as if our Minister of Health and the task force itself has probably just given up and decided, well, okay, we'll just count the number of persons who are infected on a daily basis and those who pass away. It's just like that announcement. The eighth issue, Mr. Speaker, was that we should agree that there's urgent need to update our electoral laws to ensure that there's a list of electors which reflect the reality of Guyana. I was happy to hear the Honorable Attorney General in his list of legal issues, in his list of matters that will be the subject of legislation, that he speaks towards the electoral laws. But we believe that it is an urgent priority that the voters list, the electoral list, be cleansed and it represents the true reality of what Guyana is. We cannot move forward unless that issue is taken care of. Mr. Speaker, 1 year later, these conditions remain unmet. What is the pattern of behavior of the PPP? Because if I can go to 2014, I addressed the National Assembly on 2014 on some of the similar conditions which we had asked for that administration under President Ramatar to look at. And basically what we said was that the government refused to engage in any meaningful budget talks at the tripartite level. Secondly, the government refused to reduce the toll on the Berbice River Bridge. Thirdly, the government refused to reduce the value-added tax by at least a single %, with a promise by His Excellency the President to look at the tax structure and to establish a tax committee. Fourthly, the government refused to increase old age pension to $15,000, which we were asking for in 2012. Sixthly, the government refused to commission an inquiry into the Guyana Sugar Corporation and the Guyana Power and Light as a precondition to any further subvention to these entities. Sixthly, the government refused to guarantee the independence of constitutional entities. Even after a motion was passed in the National Assembly, it continued to refuse to do so. Seventhly, the government refused to give presidential assent to any bills passed in the National Assembly, which the PPP did not support. Eighth, the government refused to address the issues affecting the National Insurance Scheme. Nine, it refused to have the monies in NISIL, the Lotto Fund, and the Guyana Geological and John Mines Commission transferred into the Consolidated Fund. 10, it refused to take action on the National Communications Network and the Government Information Agency. And it's important to note, Mr. Speaker, that we continue to have that situation until now. Only yesterday, the People's National Congress issued a statement about the biased coverage of the NCN in the debate that is taking place in the National Assembly. This was a continuing issue. And then the 11th matter we spoke about was the government's refusal at that time to establish a public procurement commission. So, Mr. Speaker, it is a pattern by the PPP that even if you raise these issues, they'll find all kinds of excuse why they should not consult, why they should not do this. So it is a pattern. So what has happened in the last year's budget and no action has been taken? I'm showing you that in 2013 and 2014, it was the same behavior by this administration. The Honorable Member Dr. Ashley Singh, Mr. Speaker, during his budget speech, spoke ad nauseum about the PPP's administration governance architecture, using descriptors that are contradictory to the nature of the People's Progressive Party government. The Honorable Member said at page 67, paragraph 4.199 of his speech, and I quote, "The governance architecture of this government is based firmly on inclusivity, participation, transparency, and accountability, and the rule of law." Mr. Speaker, nothing is further from the truth. The PPP does not, it would appear to me, possess the political maturity to be inclusive, let alone be transparent and accountable. Mr. Speaker, that the Honorable Member could have said, or what the Honorable Member should have said, should I say, is that the PPP's governance architecture is based firmly on exclusion, selective participation, opacity, unaccountability, and lawlessness. Those are the pillars on which the concept and policy trusts of our One Guyana they are creating are based. This administration, which boasts, Mr. Speaker, of inclusivity and participation, continues to defy the Constitution by failing to have consultations with critical stakeholders in this country. There's yet to be consultation on key constitutional appointments. They refuse to consult with the opposition on Budget 2022, and they shut out the regions that are managed by the coalition from the budget preparation process. The unions are being ignored when requests are made for meetings, and they are left out of meetings that are directly related to matters affecting those that they represent. Mr. Speaker, in November 2021, when the government announced the meager 7% salary increase, there was no consultation with the Guyana Public Service Union. In fact, in a Stabbuctu's article dated 20th of November 2021, the Minister of Public Service was reported as saying that they were pressed for time, and that did not allow for consultation with the unions. This is not the coalition saying that, Mr. Speaker, that they did not consult. It is the minister telling the Guyanese people that the government had no time to consult with you or your representatives on matters that directly affect your livelihood. The article went on to say that this unlawful action was taken during ongoing representation by the GPSU, which was vigorously pursuing the need for negotiations with the Ministry of the Public Service and had legitimate expectations that that would take place. Copies of all correspondence were sent to the president with the hope of presidential intervention. But sadly, that was not the case. This is the one Guyana and inclusivity that the government speaks of. Mr. Speaker, this is not the coalition telling the government that they're not inclusive and that they're lawless. The union has said that. It's also published in the Kaieteur News article that the Guyana Trade Union Congress wrote the president of our one Guyana to have a meeting on salary increases issue, and there was no response from the president. So when we say this administration is exclusive and does not seek to have meaningful consultation with all stakeholders, we are doing so clearly from a strong position. Mr. Speaker, their actions speak louder than their words. The other member, Dr. Ashley Singh, mentioned the establishment of a One Guyana Commission in 2022. Mr. Speaker, we have said it before, and we continue to say it. The PPP is visionless. They continue to dismantle every good thing created by the AP and EFC administration. Then they rebrand it and pitch it as if it is a new idea. They dismantled the Ministry of Social Cohesion and now seeks to create a One Guyana Commission. Can you remember who on the opening day sought to suggest that we promised and they delivered? Please be advised, honorable member, that we created and you broke up. We created and you broke up. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Dr. Ashley Singh went on to talk about the administration's anti-corruption framework for Guyana, stating that it's based on commitments to our treaty obligations to the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption and the UN Convention Against Corruption as well. Mr. Speaker, the AP and UFC coalition government passed the State Asset Recovery Bill of 2017, giving life to the State Asset Recovery Act and the establishment of the State Asset Recovery Agency in keeping with Guyana's commitment to the same treaty obligations mentioned by the honorable member. I must iterate, Mr. Speaker, that the government's actions speak louder than their words. When they came into office, they dismantled the State Asset Recovery Agency, and the director who they claim had too much power, they fired him. But that is not the reason why, Mr. Speaker. You see, they are masters of equivocation. They love to conceal the truth. But we will continue to bring the truth to the Guyanese people. The truth of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that they could have amended the act. They could have removed the so-called powers that they were referring to. But that would have meant that the 19+ cases that Sarah had against some of the friends and families of the PPP, which are worth billions of Guyana dollars, would have had to be carried on in the course of the court. In fact, the same week that the government closed the agency, there are matters to be heard in the court. So the only way to annul all those court cases was to shut the agency down and repeal the act. They like to say that Sarah did nothing. Well, they should have allowed those cases to take its due course and prove to the nation that we were witch hunting. Mr. Speaker, I say again, action speaks louder than words. They made sure that they removed any legislation that sought to hold them transparent and accountable. This is the true nature of the PPP. On the subject of accountability and transparency, Mr. Speaker, the PPP has over time demonstrated that they are accountable to no one, not even themselves. They came to this House, Mr. Speaker, and forced the passage of the Natural Resources Fund bill, which the majority of Guyanese agree was passed illegally. There are numerous letters to the editor calling for consultation on the bill. One such letter came from Dr. Jerry Jailal in the Kaichur News dated the 29th of December 2021. And it was titled, PPP Natural Resources Fund Bill Seek More Power and Less Accountability and Oversight. This is not a coalition saying this, Mr. Speaker. It is the citizens of this country. This is how the letter started, Mr. Speaker. There is a saying, the more you watch, the less you see. The less you watch, the better for me. End of quote. The PP was bent on using its one-seat majority to railroad the repeal of the original Natural Resources Act, approved by the coalition, replacing it with its own bill and reducing the Public Accountability and Oversight Committee from 22 to 9 persons. They wanted to watch less, and it'll be the better for them. Dr. Jailal went on to talk about their lack of consultation with stakeholders on critical national matters and a number of failed projects. Again, I say, Mr. Speaker, their actions speak louder than their words. And the people of Guyana see the PPP for who they really are. In another letter, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sarenja Dan Paul, in the same edition of the newspaper, pleaded with the president not to assent to the bill. And this is what he said, and I quote, President Ali is in a uniquely advantageous position to listen to the people and organizations who do not support passage of the bill, but ask for further consultation before the bill is law. Listen and hear the people, many of whom voted for you. This is what he is saying. This is not giving in to the opposition. This is listening to the people and telling them, I hear you. Finally, and this is what he said again, I call on President Ali to show us integrity. This is the one quality that he explicitly specified that he will require of board members.
Honorable member, I'll have to ask you to withdraw that reference to His Excellency, the President.
I withdraw it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank
Mr.
you,
Speaker, all I will say
Please proceed.
to the members on the government side of the House is show us what integrity means to you. That is what the people of Guyana want to see. And again, I say, your actions speak louder than your words. Civil society groups spoke about the poor governance structure of the bill and the fact that it lacked the key ingredients of accountability and transparency. Mr. Speaker, citizens even submitted a petition to this assembly seeking to halt the passage of the bill. The petitioners respectfully requested that the National Assembly pause the motion to debate the repeal of the Natural Resources Fund Act to provide an opportunity for the proposed amendments to be made available to the citizens of Guyana. Mr. Speaker, this is what Policy Forum Guyana had to say in a press statement in the Starbuck News dated the 31st of December 2021. And I quote, since assuming office in 2020, avenues for influencing decision-making in Guyanese politics have been progressively closed off by the ruling party. Independent voices are being silenced, and professionals replaced by compliant camp followers. As a result, institutions such as the Environmental Protection Agency, the Guyana Police Force, and the state media, while ostensibly still performing their roles, have become arms of the ruling party. Mr. Speaker, in the same vein, the dismissive parliamentary treatment of the formal petition signed by 64 citizens calling for a pause in the consideration of the Natural Resources Act is a microcosm of what politics in Guyana has become. An entirely transparent process making a modest demand for time to consult was ignored by the ruling party without explanation. Mr. Speaker, this is not a collation statement. This is what the citizens of Guyana, and this is what they're saying. And there are more statements like these, too many for me to deal with today because of the time. Mr. Speaker, amidst this national outcry, this administration decided to ignore the Guyanese people. Understandably so, because they needed the money to prop up this so-called biggest budget. And so, Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Dr. Ashley Singh needs to inform this assembly of the intended expenditure for the money being withdrawn. It is not enough to say that the money will go into the consolidated fund. Even before the money is withdrawn, it is our contention that the fund, the act, that is the new act, provides at section 16(2)(a) and (b), and it deals with withdrawals from the fund. It outlines that the funds are to be used for national development priorities and essential projects that are directly related to natural disaster. However, the fund is in the budget merely as budgetary support. The government was in such a hurry to force the bill through the assembly that they failed to realize that the act, which is now law, requires that they should state what the money is to be used for, so as to satisfy the requirement for withdrawal. It is not enough to say we will withdraw it and put it into the consolidated fund, and while it is there, we will then come to the parliament. Before you draw it, you should state what the funds are to be used for. Just a few days ago, Mr. Speaker, the Chartered Accountant and Attorney at Law, Christopher Ram, in an article carried by Kaitra News, raised a very concern as it relates to the withdrawal from the fund in defiance of what is stated in the Act at Section 16. Then, Mr. Speaker, there is Section 19, which deals with approval of withdrawals from the fund. Mr. Speaker, Section 19 reads, and I quote, "The amount that the minister shall request the National Assembly to approve as the withdrawal from the fund for the next ensuing fiscal year shall be included in the national budget proposal." Mr. Speaker, I was looking among my budget documents to see if there was any statement of request for withdrawal from the fund, and I could not find any. It is as if the PE believes that they must answer to no one. The rule of law means nothing to them. They force a bill through the assembly, and in less than a month, they are in defiance of the very act, because all they want to do is to get their hands on the money. Former Auditor General Mr. Anand Gulsaran, in his weekly Accountability Watch column in the Stabrook News on the 31st of December 2021, said he observed that Section 19 of the Act provides for the approval of the Assembly before any withdrawals are made from the fund. He contends that it raises the question as to whether the Assembly's specific approval is not required before the amounts are incorporated in the estimates. Mr. Speaker, this is not a member of the opposition questioning the possible illegal act of the government. The people are watching, and again I say to those on the government side of the House, your action speaks louder than your words. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member Dr. Ashley Singh needs to inform this nation as to whether or not the various boards as required under the new Natural Resources Fund Act, whether those boards have been established prior to the withdrawal of this fund. If so, who are these board members and when were they appointed? Mr. Speaker, in looking at the governance structure of the PPP, the Honourable Member Dr. Ashley Singh should also inform the nation as to the status of the many commissions and boards that are to safeguard the nation's wealth and aid in good governance. Are those boards and commissions constituted? Mr. Speaker, I heard the Vice President yesterday in his press conference speak to a number of boards, a number of commissions that will be established by February, the end of February. So what has been happening all along? What is this new magical date of the end of February? Mr. Speaker, for example, the Public Procurement Commission. After this administration came into office, they dismantled the PPC. Those persons whose contracts had come to an end, they allowed it to run out and never reappointed. What this did was it allowed the issuing of contracts to friends and family without the necessary oversight and scrutiny, which is provided by the Commission. Billions of dollars in contracts.
Honorable Member, I listened so I could hear what you concluded on the PPC. As far as I know, the Public Procurement Commission expired, and I have a long letter from the former chairperson addressing the issue of not having legal authority to extend people's contract. So the records of the Parliament in my office says differently.
I thank you for that clarity, Mr. Speaker. What I'm saying is that it is a pattern, you see, Mr. Speaker, that the Public Procurement Commission Act came into being while the PPP were in government before 2015. And they refused to actually bring that act, bring the commission into establishment. Again, now they are back in office. We did it while we were in office and ensure that the commission was functioning. But again, now
Honorable,
back in office and it's not.
Former leader of the opposition, and
Yes,
there is a process, and I've been seeing the issue of the Public Procurement Commission, nominations, and so in terms of the minutes of the PAC and these discussions. So it's not a single entity responsibility. I think this requires some amount of consensus with respect to the names.
Yes, I understand that, Mr. Speaker, and I thank you for that intervention too. And I'm sure that you will recognize at the end that I may need some additional time. But the point is, Mr. Speaker, that we are talking now, we're into at least 1 month, 1 year and months since this new administration came into office. And to say that it is now before the Public Accounts Committee does not sit well with the Guyanese people. I will leave this matter there, Mr. Speaker, and I will not go any further on it. Mr. Speaker, the point I want to make, however, is that the absence of these agencies, these oversight bodies, allows for the granting of contracts without the necessary oversights and without the protections that are issued, that are provided by these guardrails of democracy for those things to function. So, Mr. Speaker, the fancy talk about government architecture that is based firmly on inclusivity, participation, transparency, and accountability, and the rule of law is not something that can be taken seriously. Mr. Speaker, the fact is you cannot have good governance where there is no scrutiny and proper checks and balances. No checks and balances mean space is allowed for major acts of corruption in the expenditure of this $552 billion budget. There is no doubt as to why Guyanese have declined, Guyana has declined in its standing on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index over the last year. On this, I understand the Honorable Vice President is now blaming that on the APNU AFC. Well, everything he blames us for, so that is nothing new. Mr. Speaker, it is simply because the PPP governance structure is weak at its very core. Again, I say to the Honorable Dr. Ashley Singh, action speaks louder than words. Don't talk about good governance, show it. Mr. Speaker, allocations have been made from ministries and agencies to drive developmental programs that should better the lives of the people. However, Mr. Speaker, the glue that holds it all together and makes sure that the people benefit and those programs are successful is the way in which the governance structures function. It is not something, Mr. Speaker, sometimes which you can put a dollar value. So when the governance structure is as porous as the one this administration is resting its budget on, you can allot $20 billion for roads and bridges. But because corruption is ever present and the safeguards and guardrails are non-existent, your roads and infrastructure will crumble, just as the poles on Vicendian Road that were recently erected, and the many road works across this country that had to be remedied in a matter of weeks after they were completed. What I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, because I know many of the government side will take a while to understand it, is that you can boast about the biggest budget, how much money you allocate to a specific project or program. But when your governance structure is based firmly on exclusion, selective participation, opacity, unaccountability, lawlessness, and corruption, the majority of the populace will not directly benefit from your budget. And that is the harsh reality. Mr. Speaker, that good governance entails, I would posit also, how institutions conduct their public affairs and how a government manages public resources, ensuring that there is equity, fairness, and accountability. Good governance guarantees the realization of human rights in a manner which is essentially free of abuse and corruption, and with due regard for the rule of law. In a January 31st Skyture News article titled, "Tax Relief in Budget Are for the Rich," economist Tarun Kemraj urged direct cash transfer from the NRF to help ordinary citizens. And the article says that the tax reduction measures announced in this year's budget will not benefit the ordinary citizens of this country, and government instead should focus on ensuring that Guyanese benefit directly from the proceeds of oil resource, Professor of Economics Tarun Kemraj said. Kemraj was among the panelists of a Memorial House Trust discussion on Guyana Natural Resources Fund Act, a virtual consultation held on Saturday. In his presentation, Kemraj, a professor of economics and international studies at the New College of Florida, said, and I quote, "It is an interesting budget. It has certainly has some bright spots, but the most worrying spot of the 2022 budget is how much it mollycoddles people who are already well off." He reasoned that Vice President Barra Jagdeo recently said that he came up with an estimate that local content law alone will provide the business community with over US $600 million a year. But even with local content and the wonderful tax breaks, Kemraj said he does not see the rationale. For example, in this year's budget, government has announced measures to reduce the excise tax on double cab pickups vehicles between 2,000 and 3,000 cc. From 110%, it gone down to 75%. A similar reduction is expected to benefit other vehicles servicing the oil and gas sector, as well as cater to the increased construction activities. To this end, the economist warned, I don't see the good planning there. And of course, if you reduce the price of some of these vehicles and you make it too easy, you could have the Trinidad situation where one family now has 3 vehicles. And so what you have, you are building roads to take care of the traffic congestion. And then you're right back there in 2 or 3 years. So sustainability has to be a lot more holistic, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, good governance also requires a parliament that is handled without bias, where all members are treated equally, where the business of the people are not denied at the whim and fancy of the presiding officials without sound explanation. This is what we mean by a one Guyana, Mr. Speaker. The extensive delays in summoning parliamentary sittings, the many opposition motions denied, and questions that went unanswered, and the determination that matters such as a flooding of our communities are not urgent. This is basically not what we consider to be good governance and to lead a better one Guyana. To share a more recent occurrence, Mr. Speaker, the reasons given for the dismissal of the opposition motion, which suggests that the opposition could not have brought a legal motion over an illegal action that it initiated in the first place, in our view, or in my view, has no proper foundation in law. Even though there was some legal maxim quoted, Mr. Speaker, I think that is more the exception than the rule. What that is saying is, Mr. Speaker, if someone initiates an argument and the other person then physically assaults the initiator of the argument, then the person that initiated the argument cannot make a report to the police and to get a redress. That has to be ludicrous, Mr. Speaker. The National Assembly is the highest decision-making forum in the land. And we cannot, if we cannot get it right here in this House, Mr. Speaker, we'll be dominated by a governance system which can soon crumble. Mr. Speaker and colleagues, I leave you with the words of a former president of Guyana, Sir Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. And he said, the destiny of the cooperative republic is in our hands. Let these be safe hands. Mr. Speaker, for the many issues highlighted in my presentation, and the fact that a major portion of this budget is funded by withdrawals from the Natural Resources Fund, which the opposition considers to be illegal, I cannot support this budget. And on that point, I say thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the members for listening. I thank you.